Henri Bergson, The Revolt Against Materialism. The history of modern philosophy might be written in terms of the warfare of physics and psychology. Thought may begin with its object and at last in consistency try to bring its own mystical reality within the circle of material phenomena and mechanical law. Or it may begin with itself and be driven by the apparent necessities of logic to conceive all things as forms and creatures of mind. The priority of mathematics and mechanics in the development of modern science, and the reciprocal stimulation of industry and physics under the common pressure of expanding needs, gave to speculation a materialistic impulsion, and the most successful of the sciences became the models of philosophy. Despite Descartes' insistence that philosophy should begin with the self and travel outward, the industrialization of Western Europe drove thought away from thought and in the direction of material things. Spencer's system was the culminating expression of this mechanical point of view. Hailed though he was as the philosopher of Darwinism, he was more truly the reflex and exponent of industrialism. He endowed industry with glories and virtues which to our hindsight seem ridiculous, and his outlook was rather that of a mechanician and an engineer absorbed in the motions of matter than that of a biologist feeling the élan of life. The rapid obsolescence of his philosophy is due largely to the replacement of the physical by the biological standpoint in recent thought, by the growing disposition to see the essence and secret of the world in the movement of life rather than in the inertia of things. And indeed, matter itself has in our days almost taken on life. The study of electricity, magnetism, and the electron has given a vitalistic tinge to physics, so that instead of a reduction of psychology to physics, which was the more or less conscious ambition of English thought, we approach a vitalized physics and an almost spiritualized matter. It was Schopenhauer who first, in modern thought, emphasized the possibility of making the concept of life more fundamental and inclusive than that of force. It is Bergson who, in our own generation, has taken up this idea and has almost converted a skeptical world to it by the force of his sincerity and his eloquence. Bergson was born in Paris in 1859 of French and Jewish parentage. He was an eager student and seems to have taken every prize that turned up. He did homage to the traditions of modern science by specializing at first in mathematics and physics, but his faculty for analysis soon brought him face to face with the metaphysical problems that lurk behind every science, and he turned spontaneously to philosophy. In 1878 he entered the École Normale Supérieure, and on graduating was appointed to teach philosophy at the Lycée of Clermont-Ferrand. There in 1888 he wrote his first major work, the Essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience, translated as Time and Free Will. 8 quiet years intervened before the appearance of his next, and his most difficult book, Matière et Mémoire. In 1898 he became professor at the École Normale, and in 1900 at the Collège de France, where he remained until his death in 1941. In 1907 he won international fame with his masterpiece, L'évolution créatrice, Creative Evolution. He became almost overnight the most popular figure in the philosophic world, and all that was needed for his success was the placing of his books upon the Index Expurgatorius in 1914. In that same year he was elected to the French Academy. It is a remarkable thing that Bergson, the David destined to stay the Goliath of materialism, was in youth a devotee of Spencer. But too much knowledge leads to skepticism. Early devotees are the likeliest apostates, as early sinners are senile saints. The more he studied Spencer, the more keenly conscious Bergson became of the 3 rheumatic joints of the materialist mechanism, between matter and life, between body and mind, and between determinism and choice. The patience of Pasteur had discredited the belief in abiogenesis, the generation of life by non-living matter, and after 100 years of theory and 1,000 vain experiments, the materialists were no nearer than before to solving the problem of the origin of life. Again, though thought and brain were obviously connected, the mode of connection was as far from obvious as it had ever been. If mind was matter and every mental act a mechanical resultant of neutral states, of what use was consciousness? Why could not the material mechanism of the brain dispense with this epiphenomenon, as the honest and logical Huxley called it, this apparently useless flame thrown up by the heat of cerebral commotion? Finally, was determinism any more intelligible than free will? If the present moment contains no living and creative choice and is totally and mechanically the product of the matter and motion of the moment before, then so was that moment the mechanical effect of the moment that preceded it, and that again of the one before, and so on, until we arrive at the primeval nebula as the total cause of every later event, of every line of Shakespeare's plays, and every suffering of his soul, so that the somber rhetoric of Hamlet and Othello, of Macbeth and Lear, in every clause and every phrase, was written far off there in the distant skies and the distant eons by the structure and content of that legendary cloud. What a draught upon credulity! What an exercise of faith such a theory must demand in this unbelieving generation! What mystery or miracle of Old Testament or New could be half so incredible as this monstrous fatalistic myth, this nebula composing tragedies? There was matter enough for rebellion here, and if Bergson rose so rapidly to fame, it was because he had the courage to doubt where all the doubters piously believed. Mind and Brain. We naturally incline to materialism, Bergson argues, because we tend to think in terms of space. We are geometricians all. But time is as fundamental as space, and it is time, no doubt, that holds the essence of life and perhaps of all reality. What we have to understand is that time is an accumulation, a growth, a duration. Duration is the continuous progress of the past which gnaws into the future and which swells as it advances. It means that the past in its entirety is prolonged into the present and abides there actual and acting. Duration means that the past endures, that nothing of it is quite lost. Doubtless we think with only a small part of our past, but it is with our entire past that we desire, will, and act. And since time is an accumulation, the future can never be the same as the past, for a new accumulation arises at every step. Each moment is not only something new, but something unforeseeable. Change is far more radical than we suppose. And that geometrical predictability of all things, which is the goal of a mechanist science, is only an intellectualist delusion. At least, for a conscious being, to exist is to change is to mature is to go on creating oneself endlessly. What if this is true of all things? Perhaps all reality is time and duration, becoming and change. In ourselves, memory is the vehicle of duration, the handmaiden of time, and through it so much of our past is actively retained that rich alternatives present themselves for every situation. As life grows richer in its scope, its heritage, and its memories, the field of choice widens, and at last the variety of possible responses generates consciousness, which is the rehearsal of response. Consciousness seems proportionate to the living being's power of choice. It lights up the zone of potentialities that surrounds the act. It fills the interval between what is done and what might be done. It is no useless appendage. It is a vivid theater of imagination, where alternative responses are pictured and tested before the irrevocable choice. In reality, then, a living being is a center of action. It represents a sum of contingency entering into the world, that is to say, a certain quantity of possible action. Man is no passive adaptive machine. He is a focus of redirected force, a center of creative evolution. Free will is a corollary of consciousness. To say that we are free is merely to mean that we know what we are doing. The primary function of memory is to evoke all those past perceptions which are analogous to the present perception, to recall to us what preceded and what followed them, and so to suggest to us that decision which is the most useful. But this is not all. By allowing us to grasp in a single intuition multiple moments of duration, it frees us from the movement of the flow of things, that is to say, from the rhythm of necessity. The more of these moments memory can contract into one, the firmer is the hold which it gives to us on matter. so that the memory of a living being appears indeed to measure, above all, its powers of action upon things. If determinists were right, and every act were the automatic and mechanical resultant of pre-existent forces, motive would flow into action with lubricated ease. But on the contrary, choice is burdensome and effortful. It requires resolution, a lifting up of the power of personality against the spiritual gravitation of impulse or habit or sloth. Choice is creation, and creation is labor. Hence the worried features of men, and their weary envy of the choiceless routine of animals, who are so placid and self-contained. But the Confucian peacefulness of your dog is no philosophic calm, no quiet surface of unfathomed depth. It is the certainty of instinct, the orderliness of an animal that need not and cannot choose. In the animal, invention is never anything but a variation on the theme of routine. Shut up in the habits of the species, it succeeds, no doubt, in enlarging them by its individual initiative. But it escapes automatism only for an instant, for just the time to create a new automatism. The gates of its prison close as soon as they are opened. By pulling at its chain, it succeeds only in stretching it. With man, consciousness breaks the chain. In man and man alone, it sets itself free. Mind, then, is not identical with brain. Consciousness depends upon the brain and falls with it. But so does a coat fall with the nail on which it hangs, which does not prove that the coat is an epiphenomenon, an ornamental ectoplasm of the nail. The brain is the system of images and reaction patterns. Consciousness is the recall of images and the choice of reactions. The direction of the stream is distinct from the riverbed, although it must adopt its winding course. Consciousness is distinct from the organism which it animates, although it must undergo its vicissitudes. It is sometimes said that in ourselves consciousness is directly connected with a brain, and that we must therefore attribute consciousness to living beings which have a brain, and deny it to those which have none. But it is easy to see the fallacy of such an argument. It would be just as though we should say that because in ourselves digestion is directly connected with a stomach, therefore only living things with a stomach can digest. We should be entirely wrong, for it is not necessary to have a stomach, nor even to have special organs in order to digest. An amoeba digests, although it is an almost undifferentiated protoplasmic mass. What is true is that in proportion to the complexity and perfection of an organism, there is a division of labor. Special organs are assigned special functions, and the faculty of digestion is localized in the stomach, or rather is a general digestive apparatus, which works better because confined to that one function alone. In like manner, consciousness in man is unquestionably connected with the brain, but it by no means follows that a brain is indispensable to consciousness. The lower we go in the animal series, the more nervous centers are simplified and separate from one another, and at last they disappear altogether, merged in the general mass of an organism with hardly any differentiation. If then at the top of the scale of living beings consciousness is attached to very complicated nervous centers, must we not suppose that it accompanies the nervous system down its whole descent, and that when at last the nerve stuff is merged in the yet undifferentiated living matter, consciousness is still there, diffused, confused, but not reduced to nothing? Theoretically, then, everything living might be conscious. In principle, consciousness is coextensive with life. Why is it, nevertheless, that we seem to think of mind and thought in terms of matter and the brain? It is because that part of our minds which we call the intellect is a constitutional materialist. It was developed in the process of evolution to understand and deal with material spatial objects. From this field it derives all its concepts and its laws, and its notion of a fatalistic and predictable regularity everywhere. Our intellect, in the narrow sense of the word, is intended to secure the perfect fitting of our body to its environment, to represent the relations of external things among themselves, in short, to think matter. It is at home with solids, inert things. It sees all becoming as being, as a series of states. It misses the connective tissue of things, the flow of duration that constitutes their very life. Look at the moving picture. It seems to our tired eyes to be alive with motion and action. Here, surely, science and mechanism have caught the continuity of life. On the contrary, it is just here that science and the intellect reveal their limitations. The moving picture does not move, is not a picture of motion. It is only a series of instantaneous photographs, snapshots, taken in such rapid succession that when they are thrown in rapid succession upon the screen, the willing spectator enjoys the illusion of continuity, as he did in his boyhood with thumbnail movies of his pugilistic heroes. But it is an illusion nonetheless, and the cinema film is obviously a series of pictures in which everything is as still as if eternally congealed. And as the motion picture camera divides into static poses the vivid current of reality, so the human intellect catches a series of states, but loses the continuity that weaves them into life. We see matter and we miss energy. We think that we know what matter is, but when at the heart of the atom we find energy, we are bewildered, and our categories melt away. No doubt, for greater strictness, all considerations of motion may be eliminated from mathematical processes, but the introduction of motion into the genesis of figures is nevertheless the origin of modern mathematics. Nearly all the progress of mathematics in the 19th century was due to the use of the concepts of time and motion in addition to the traditional geometry of space. All through contemporary science, as one sees in Mach and Pearson and Henri Poincaré, there runs the uncomfortable suspicion that exact science is merely an approximation, which catches the inertia of reality better than its life. But it is our own fault if, by insisting on the application of physical concepts in the field of thought, we end in the impasse of determinism, mechanism, and materialism. The merest moment of reflection might have shown how inappropriate the concepts of physics are in the world of mind. We think as readily of a mile as of half a mile, and one flash of thought can circumnavigate the globe. Our ideas elude every effort to picture them as material particles moving in space, or as limited by space in their flight and operation. Life escapes these solid concepts, for life is a matter of time rather than of space. It is not position, it is change. It is not quantity so much as quality. It is not a mere redistribution of matter and motion. It is fluid and persistent creation. A very small element of a curve is very near to being a straight line, and the smaller it is, the nearer. In the limit it may be termed a part of the straight line, as you please, for in each of its points a curve coincides with its tangent. So, likewise, vitality is tangent, at any and every point, to physical and chemical forces. But such points are, in fact, only views taken by a mind which imagines stops at various moments of the movement that generates the curve. In reality, life is no more made up of physico-chemical elements than a curve is composed of straight lines. How then shall we catch the flow and essence of life, if not by thinking and the intellect? But is the intellect all? Let us for a while stop thinking, and just gaze upon that inner reality, ourselves, which is better known to us than all things else. What do we see? Mind, not matter. Time, not space. Action, not passivity. Choice, not mechanism. We see life in its subtle and penetrating flow, not in its states of mind, not in its devitalized and separated parts, as when the zoologist examines a dead frog's legs, or studies preparations under a microscope, and thinks that he is a biologist studying life. This direct perception, this simple and steady looking upon, intueor, a thing, is intuition, not any mystic process, but the most direct examination possible to the human mind. Spinoza was right. Reflective thought is not by any means the highest form of knowledge. It is better, no doubt, than hearsay, but how weak it is beside the direct perception of the thing itself. A true empiricism is one that sets itself the task of getting as close as possible to the original, of sounding the depths of life, of feeling the pulse of its spirit by a sort of intellectual auscultation. We listen in on the current of life. By direct perception we feel the presence of mind. By intellectual circumlocution we arrive at the notion that thought is a dance of molecules in the brain. Is there any doubt that intuition here beholds more truly the heart of life? This does not mean that thinking is a disease, as Rousseau held, or that the intellect is a treacherous thing which every decent citizen should forswear. The intellect retains its normal function of dealing with the material and spatial world, and with the material aspects or spatial expressions of life and mind. Intuition is limited to the direct feeling of life and mind, not in their external embodiments, but in their inner being. I have never maintained that it was necessary to put something different in the place of intellect, or to set instinct above it. I have simply tried to show that when we leave the domain of mathematics and physics to enter that of life and consciousness, we must make our appeal to a certain sense of life, which cuts across pure understanding and has its origin in the same vital impulse as instinct, although instinct, properly so called, is quite a different thing. Nor do we try to refute intellect by intellect. We merely adopt the language of the understanding, since only the understanding has a language. We cannot help it if the very words that we use are psychological only by symbolism and still reek with the material connotations forced upon them by their origin. Spirit means breath, and mind means a measure, and thinking points to a thing. Nevertheless, these are the crass media through which the soul must express itself. It will be said that we do not transcend our intellect, for it is still with our intellect, and through our intellect, that we see the other forms of consciousness. Even introspection and intuition are materialistic metaphors. And this would be a legitimate objection if there did not remain around our conceptual and logical thought a vague nebulosity made of the very substance out of which has been formed the luminous nucleus that we call the intellect. The new psychology is revealing in us a mental region incomparably wider than the intellect. To explore the most sacred depths of the unconscious, to labor in the subsoil of consciousness, that will be the principal task of psychology in the century which is opening. I do not doubt that wonderful discoveries await it there. Creative evolution. With this new orientation, evolution appears to us as something quite different from the blind and dreary mechanism of struggle and destruction which Darwin and Spencer described. We sense duration in evolution, the accumulation of vital powers, the inventiveness of life and mind, the continual elaboration of the absolutely new. We are prepared to understand why the most recent and expert investigators, like Jennings and Maupas, reject the mechanical theory of protozoan behavior, and why Professor E.B. Wilson, Dean of Contemporary Cytologists, concludes his book on the cell with the statement that the study of the cell has, on the whole, seemed to widen rather than to narrow the enormous gap that separates even the lowest forms of life from the inorganic world. And everywhere in the world of biology one hears of the rebellion against Darwin. Darwinism means, presumably, the origin of new organs and functions, new organisms and species, by the natural selection of favorable variations. But this conception, hardly half a century old, is already worm-eaten with difficulties. How, on this theory, did the instincts originate? It would be convenient to conceive them as the inherited accumulation of acquired habits, but expert opinion closes that door in our faces, though some day that door may be opened. If only congenital powers and qualities are transmissible, every instinct must have been, on its first appearance, as strong as it natively is now. It must have been born, so to speak, adult, in full panoply for action, else it could not have favored its possessor in the struggle for existence. If on its first appearance it was weak, it could have achieved survival value only through that acquired strength which, by current hypothesis, is not inherited. Every origin is here a miracle. And as with the first instincts, so with every variation. One wonders how the change could have offered, in its first form, a handle to selection. In the case of such complex organs as the eye, the difficulty is discouraging. Either the eye appeared at once, full-formed and competent, which is as credible as Jonah's introspection of the whale, or it began with a series of fortuitous variations, which, by a still more fortuitous survival, produced the eye. At every step, the theory of a mechanical production of complicated structures by a blind process of variation and selection presents us with fairy tales that have all the incredibility of childhood's lore and little of its beauty. The most decisive difficulty, however, is the appearance of similar effects brought about by different means in widely divergent lines of evolution. Take as example the invention of sex as a mode of reproduction, both in plants and in animals. Here are lines of evolution as divergent as could be, and yet the same complex accident occurs in both. Or take the organs of sight in two very distinct phyla, the mollusks and the vertebrates. How could the same small variations, incalculable in number, have ever occurred in the same order on two independent lines of evolution if they were purely accidental? More remarkable still, nature arrives at identical results in sometimes neighboring species by entirely different embryogenic processes. The retina of the vertebrate is produced by an expansion of the rudimentary brain of the embryo. In the mollusk, on the contrary, the retina is derived from the ectoderm directly. If the crystalline lens of a triton be removed, it is regenerated by the iris. Now, the original lens was built out of the ectoderm, while the iris is of mesodermal origin. What is more, in the Salamandra maculata, if the lens be removed and the iris left, the regeneration of the lens takes place at the upper part of the iris. But if this upper part of the iris itself be taken away, the regeneration takes place in the inner or retinal layer of the remaining region. Thus, parts differently situated, differently constituted, meant normally for different functions, are capable of performing the same duties and even of manufacturing, when necessary, the same pieces of the machine. So, in amnesia and aphasia, lost memories and functions reappear in regenerated or substituted tissues. Surely we have here overwhelming evidence that there is something more in evolution than a helpless mechanism of material parts. Life is more than its machinery. It is a power that can grow, that can restore itself, that can mold to its own will some measure of environing circumstance. Not that there is any external design determining these marvels. That would be merely an inverted mechanism, a fatalism as destructive of human initiative and of creative evolution as the somber surrender of Hindu thought to India's heat. We must get beyond both points of view, mechanism and finalism, as being at bottom only standpoints to which the human mind has been led by considering the work of men. We thought at first that all things moved because of some quasi-human will using them as instruments in a cosmic game. And then we thought that the cosmos itself was a machine because we had been dominated in character and philosophy by our mechanical age. There is a design in things, but in them, not outside, an entelechy, an inward determination of all the parts by the function and purpose of the whole. Life is that which makes efforts, which pushes upwards and outwards and on, always and always the procreant urge of the world. It is the opposite of inertia and the opposite of accident. There is a direction in the growth to which it is self-impelled. Against it is the undertow of matter, the lag and slack of things toward relaxation and rest and death. At every stage, life has had to fight with the inertia of its vehicle. And if it conquers death through reproduction, it does so only by yielding every citadel in turn and abandoning every individual body at last to inertia and decay. Even to stand is to defy matter and its laws, while to move about, to go forth and seek, and not, plant-like, to wait, is a victory purchased at every moment by effort and fatigue. And consciousness slips, as soon as it is permitted, into the restful automatism of instinct, habit, and sleep. At the outset, life is almost as inert as matter. It takes a stationary form, as if the vital impulse were too weak to risk the adventure of motion. And in one great avenue of development, this motionless stability has been the goal of life. The bending lily and the majestic oak are altars to the god security. But life was not content with this stay-at-home existence of the plant. Always its advances have been away from security towards freedom, away from carapaces, scales and hides and other burdensome protections, to the ease and perilous liberty of the bird. So the heavy hoplite was supplanted by the legionary. The knight, clad in armor, had to give place to the light, free-moving infantryman. And in a general way, in the evolution of life, just as in the evolution of human societies and of individual destinies, the greatest successes have been for those who accepted the heaviest risks. So, too, man has ceased to evolve new organs on his body. He makes tools and weapons instead, and lays them aside when they are not needed, rather than carry all his armament at every step, like those gigantic fortresses, the mastodon and the megatherium, whose heavy security lost them the mastery of the globe. Life may be impeded as well as aided by its instruments. It is with instincts as with organs. They are the tools of the mind. And like all organs that are attached and permanent, they become burdens when the environment that needed them has disappeared. Instinct comes ready-made and gives decisive and usually successful responses to stereotyped and ancestral situations. But it does not adapt the organism to change. It does not enable man to meet flexibly the fluid complexities of modern life. It is the vehicle of security, while intellect is the organ of an adventurous liberty. It is life taking on the blind obedience of the machine. How significant it is that we laugh, usually, when a living thing behaves like matter, like a mechanism, when the clown tumbles about aimlessly and leans against pillars that are not there, or when our best beloved falls on an icy path and we are tempted to laugh first and ask questions afterward. That geometrical life which Spinoza almost confused with deity is really a reason for humor and tears. It is ridiculous and shameful that their philosophy should describe them so. Life has taken 3 lines in its evolution. In one, it relapsed into the almost material torpor of plants and found there occasionally a supine security and the cowardly tenure of 1,000 years. In another avenue, its spirit and effort congealed into instinct, as in the ants and bees. But in the vertebrates, it took the dare of freedom, cast off its ready-made instincts, and marched bravely into the endless risks of thought. Instinct still remains the profounder mode of visioning reality and catching the essence of the world, but intelligence grows ever stronger and bolder and wider in its scope. It is at last in intelligence that life has placed its interests and its hopes. This persistently creative life, of which every individual and every species is an experiment, is what we mean by God. God and life are one. But this God is finite, not omnipotent, limited by matter and overcoming its inertia painfully, step by step, and not omniscient, but groping gradually towards knowledge and consciousness and more light. God, thus defined, has nothing of the ready-made. He is unceasing life, action, freedom. Creation, so conceived, is not a mystery. We experience it in ourselves when we act freely, when we consciously choose our actions and plot our lives. Our struggles and our sufferings, our ambitions and our defeats, our yearnings to be better and stronger than we are the voice and current of the élan vital in us, that vital urge which makes us grow and transforms this wandering planet into a theater of unending creation. And who knows but that at last life may win the greatest victory of all over its ancient enemy, matter, and learn even to elude mortality. Let us have an open mind even to our hopes. All things are possible to life if time is generous. Consider what life and mind have done in the mere moment of a millennium with the forests of Europe and America, and then see how foolish it is to put up barriers to life's achievements. The animal takes its stand on the plant, man bestrides animality, and the whole of humanity, in space and time, is one immense army galloping beside and before and behind each of us in an overwhelming charge able to beat down every resistance and clear the most formidable obstacles, perhaps even death. Criticism. I believe, says Bergson, that the time given to refutation in philosophy is usually time lost. Of the many attacks directed by the many thinkers against each other, what now remains? Nothing, or assuredly very little. That which counts and endures is the modicum of positive truth which each contributes. The true statement is of itself able to displace the erroneous idea, and becomes, without our having taken the trouble of refuting anyone, the best of refutations. This is the voice of wisdom herself. When we prove or disprove a philosophy, we are merely offering another one. which, like the first, is a fallible compound of experience and hope. As experience widens and hope changes, we find more truth in the falsehoods we denounced, and perhaps more falsehood in our youth's eternal truths. When we are lifted up on the wings of rebellion, we like determinism and mechanism. They are so cynical and devilish. But when death looms up suddenly at the foot of the hill, we try to see beyond it into another hope. Philosophy is a function of age. Nevertheless, what strikes one first in reading Bergson is the style. Brilliant not with the paradox fireworks of Nietzsche, but with a steady brightness, as of a man who is resolved to live up to the fine traditions of luminous French prose. It is harder to be wrong in French than in some other languages, for the French will not tolerate obscurity, and truth is clearer than fiction. If Bergson is occasionally obscure, it is by the squandered wealth of his imagery, his analogies, and his illustrations. He has an almost Semitic passion for metaphor, and is apt at times to substitute ingenious simile for patient proof. We have to be on our guard against this image-maker, as one bewares of a jeweler or a real estate poet, while recognizing gratefully, in creative evolution, our century's first philosophic masterpiece. Perhaps Bergson would have been wiser to base his criticism of the intellect on the grounds of a broader intelligence rather than on the ukases of intuition. Introspective intuition is as fallible as external sense. Each must be tested and corrected by matter-of-fact experience, and each can be trusted only so far as its findings illumine and advance our action. Bergson presumes too much in supposing that the intellect catches only the states and not the flux of reality and life. Thought is a stream of transitive ideas, as James had shown before Bergson wrote. Ideas are merely points that memory selects in the flow of thought, and the mental current adequately reflects the continuity of perception and the movement of life. It was a wholesome thing that this eloquent challenge should check the excesses of intellectualism, but it was as unwise to offer intuition in the place of thought as it would be to correct the fancies of youth with the fairy tales of childhood. Let us correct our errors forward, not backward. To say that the world suffers from too much intellect would require the courage of a madman. The romantic protest against thinking, from Rousseau and Chateaubriand to Bergson and Nietzsche and James, has done its work. We will agree to dethrone the goddess of reason if we are not asked to relight the candles before the icon of intuition. Man exists by instinct, but he progresses by intelligence. That which is best in Bergson is his attack upon materialist mechanism. Our pundits of the laboratory had become a little too confident of their categories and thought to squeeze all the cosmos into a test tube. Materialism is like a grammar that recognizes only nouns, but reality, like language, contains action as well as objects, verbs as well as substantives, life and motion as well as matter. One could understand perhaps a merely molecular memory, like the fatigue of overburdened steel, but molecular foresight, molecular planning, molecular idealism? Had Bergson met these new dogmas with a cleansing skepticism, he might have been a little less constructive, but he would have left himself less open to reply. His doubts melt away when his system begins to form. He never stops to ask what matter is, whether it may not be somewhat less inert than we have thought, whether it may be not life's enemy, but life's willing menial if life but knew its mind. He thinks of the world and the spirit, of body and soul, of matter and life, as hostile to each other. But matter and body and the world are merely the materials that wait to be formed by intelligence and will. And who knows that these things, too, are not forms of life and auguries of mind? Perhaps here, too, as Heraclitus would say, there are gods. Bergson's critique of Darwinism issues naturally from his vitalism. He carries on the French tradition established by Lamarck and sees impulse and desire as active forces in evolution. His spirited temper rejects the Spencerian conception of an evolution engineered entirely by the mechanical integration of matter and dissipation of motion. Life is a positive power, an effort that builds its organs through the very persistence of its desires. We must admire the thoroughness of Bergson's biological preparation, His familiarity with the literature, even with the periodicals in which current science hides itself for a decade of probation. He offers his erudition modestly, never with the elephantine dignity that weighs down the pages of Spencer. All in all, his criticism of Darwin has proved effective. The specifically Darwinian features of the evolution theory are now generally abandoned. In many ways, the relation of Bergson to the age of Darwin is a replica of Kant's relation to Voltaire. Kant strove to repulse that great wave of secular and partly atheistic intellectualism which had begun with Bacon and Descartes and had ended in the skepticism of Diderot and Hume, and his effort took the line of denying the finality of intellect in the field of transcendental problems. But Darwin unconsciously, and Spencer consciously, renewed the assaults which Voltaire and his more than Voltairean followers had leveled at the ancient faith, and mechanist materialism, which had given ground before Kant and Schopenhauer, had won all of its old power at the beginning of our century. Bergson attacked it, not with a Kantian critique of knowledge, nor with the idealist contention that matter is known only through mind, but by following the lead of Schopenhauer and seeking in the objective as well as in the subjective world an energizing principle, an active entelechy, which might make more intelligible the miracles and subtleties of life. Never was vitalism so forcefully argued or so attractively dressed. Bergson soared to an early popularity because he had come to the defense of hopes which spring eternally in the human breast. When people found that they could believe in immortality and deity without losing the respect of philosophy, they were pleased and grateful. And Bergson's lecture room became the salon of splendid ladies happy to have their heart's desires upheld with such learned eloquence. Strangely mingled with them were the ardent syndicalists, who found in Bergson's critique of intellectualism a justification of their gospel of less thought and more action. But this sudden popularity exacted its price. The contradictory nature of Bergson's support disintegrated his following, and Bergson may share the fate of Spencer, who lived to be present at the burial of his own reputation. Yet, of all contemporary contributions to philosophy, Bergson's is the most precious. We needed his emphasis on the elusive contingency of things and the remolding activity of mind. We were near to thinking of the world as a finished and predetermined show, in which our initiative was a self-delusion and our efforts a devilish humor of the gods. After Bergson, we come to see the world as the stage and the material of our own originative powers. Before him we were cogs and wheels in a vast and dead machine. Now, if we wish it, we can help to write our own parts in the drama of creation.